Have you ever looked back at your past relationships and thought, how did I end up here again? Different face, different name, same confusion, same anxiety, same ending. At first, it feels like bad luck. You tell yourself maybe you just haven't met the right person yet. Maybe you just attract emotionally unavailable people. Maybe the world is full of toxic partners. But what if the pattern isn't random? What if it's psychological? What if the real question isn't, why do they keep hurting me? But, why does this feel familiar to me? That question changes everything. Because this conversation is not about blaming you. It's about understanding you. And I want to say something gently but clearly. Most people don't repeatedly enter toxic relationships because they're weak. They do it because their nervous system feels at home in dynamics that resemble their past. And the body chooses long before the mind does. You can consciously want peace, but unconsciously crave intensity. You can say you want stability, but feel drawn to unpredictability. You can tell your friends, I just want something healthy. But when healthy shows up, it feels boring. Why? Because peace is unfamiliar, and the nervous system does not prioritize healthy, it prioritizes familiar. That distinction is uncomfortable, but it's powerful. I've seen this pattern not just in others, but in myself. There was a time when I mistook chemistry for connection, when intensity felt like intimacy, when emotional highs felt like love. And every time it ended, I would say the same thing. I don't understand why this keeps happening. But eventually, a harder question appeared. What part of me feels at home in this? That was not an easy question, because it required shifting from victim to participant. Not in a blaming way, in an aware way. There's a difference. When we call every ex toxic, it gives us relief. It protects our ego. It protects our self-image, but it doesn't change the pattern. Understanding does. So today, we're not going to talk about how to avoid toxic people. We're going to talk about why you're magnetized towards certain emotional dynamics. We're going to look at attachment conditioning, trauma bonding, nervous system familiarity, fantasy attachment, low self-worth patterns, fear of abandonment, and we're going to do it without shame. Because shame keeps you stuck. Clarity sets you free. Here's something most people never realize. Attraction is not random, it's patterned, and patterns are built early. Long before dating apps, long before adult relationships, long before you even knew what love was. Your first emotional environment taught you what normal feels like. If love felt inconsistent, you may now chase inconsistency. If affection was unpredictable, unpredictability may feel exciting. If you had to earn approval, you may now overfunction in relationships. Not because you're broken, because you adapted. And adaptation is powerful. But what protects you as a child can sabotage you as an adult. The nervous system doesn't understand time, it only understands familiarity. So when someone triggers the same emotional rhythm you experienced early in life, your body says, this is known territory, even if it hurts, even if it destabilizes you, even if it costs you your peace. That's why toxic relationships often feel magnetic, not because they're good, but because they're familiar. And familiarity creates a false sense of safety. Now here's the part that matters. Once you see the pattern, you can interrupt it, but you can't interrupt what you refuse to acknowledge. And that's why awareness is the first form of self-respect, not self-blame. Self-respect. Because when you understand your conditioning, you stop chasing intensity and start choosing stability. You stop confusing adrenaline for intimacy. You stop falling in love with potential. You stop ignoring red flags to avoid loneliness. You stop abandoning yourself to keep someone else. That doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't happen by accident. It happens through conscious examination. So as we move through this conversation, I want you to listen without defensiveness. without judgment, without rushing to label anyone else. Instead, ask yourself quietly, what feels familiar to me in love? What emotional dynamics do I repeatedly participate in? When did I first learn that love felt like this? Because the goal isn't to make you distrust relationships. The goal is to help you become someone who no longer finds chaos attractive. There's a difference between being drawn to someone and being pulled by unresolved wounds, and many people mistake the second for the first. By the end of this video, I don't want you to just understand toxic relationships. I want you to understand your role in the pattern, not so you feel guilty, but so you feel empowered. Because once you see it clearly, you can change it. And here's the truth I've learned over time. You don't break toxic cycles by finding better people. You break them by becoming someone who no longer participates in the same emotional script. And that begins now. Let's look at the first pattern. Chapter 1. Familiar pain feels safer than unknown. Peace. There is something unsettling about peace when you are not used to it. Not because peace is bad, but because your body doesn't recognize it. Most people assume attraction is a conscious choice. They think they are evaluating personality, compatibility, shared values. But in reality, attraction is often a nervous system reaction. Before logic speaks, the body decides. And the body is not asking, is this healthy? It is asking, have I felt this before? That difference explains more than most people realize. When someone feels instantly magnetic, it's rarely random. It's usually familiar. Maybe they are emotionally distant in a way that mirrors someone from your past. Maybe their unpredictability recreates an old emotional rhythm. Maybe their intensity matches the chaos you once had to navigate. And your nervous system says, I know this. Familiarity feels safe even when it hurts, especially when it hurts in a way you already understand. There is a strange comfort in knowing how the pain unfolds. You know when they will withdraw. You know how you will chase. You know the cycle. It's painful, yes, but it's predictable. And predictability, even painful predictability, feels safer than the unknown. The unknown is what real peace looks like at first. Calm communication, consistent behavior, no emotional games. For someone who grew up in emotional stability, that feels normal. For someone who grew up in unpredictability, it feels suspicious. Your nervous system may interpret calm as boredom. It may interpret stability as lack of passion. It may interpret emotional availability as too easy. But what's really happening is recalibration and comfort. Your body has been trained to associate love with activation, highs and lows, distance and closeness, silence and reconciliation. That roller coaster becomes your baseline. And when you meet someone who doesn't activate your survival patterns, your system feels understimulated. Not because they are wrong, because they are different from what your body recognizes. This is why many people leave healthy partners saying there was just no spark. But what they really mean is there was no chaos. And if your early emotional experiences wired you to equate chaos with connection, calm will feel empty. This wiring often begins in childhood. If affection was inconsistent, you learn to work for it. If love was conditional, you learn to earn it. If emotional safety was unstable, you learn to monitor it. As a child, that adaptation helped you survive. As an adult, it distorts your attraction. Because now, instead of feeling drawn to secure energy, you feel drawn to familiar tension. There is a biological layer to this. When relationships are unpredictable, your brain releases dopamine in irregular bursts. Intermittent reinforcement is one of the strongest forms of attachment conditioning. It's the same mechanism behind gambling addiction. You don't know when the reward is coming, so you stay engaged. In toxic dynamics, affection becomes the reward, withdrawal becomes the uncertainty, and your nervous system stays alert, waiting for the next emotional high. That alertness feels like passion, but it's actually hypervigilance. The body in survival mode is not in love. It is scanning for abandonment, scanning for rejection, scanning for signs that it needs to react. When you grow up in environments where love felt unstable, your body learned that closeness requires effort. So when someone shows up calmly and consistently, your system may not know how to relax. Relaxation feels foreign, and foreign can feel unsafe. That is why familiar pain often wins over unfamiliar peace, not because you want suffering, but because your nervous system trusts what it knows. The tragedy is not that you choose pain, it's that you confuse familiarity with compatibility. Compatibility is built on shared values, emotional regulation, and mutual respect. Familiarity is built on memory, and memory is not always aligned with your growth. You might say you want stability, but if stability feels quiet compared to the intensity you're used to, your body may interpret quiet as absence. You might say you want someone emotionally available, but when someone responds consistently, without games, it may feel anticlimactic, because there is no chase. And if you learned that love must be chased, you may not recognize love that stays. This is where awareness becomes essential. Instead of asking, "Why am I attracted to this person?" ask, "What does this dynamic remind my body of?" Instead of asking, "Why does calm feel boring?" ask, "What did my nervous system learn to expect from closeness?" When you shift from blaming yourself to understanding your conditioning, something changes. You stop seeing attraction as destiny, and you start seeing it as programming. Programming can be rewritten, but first it must be observed. There will be a phase in healing where peace feels uncomfortable, where stability feels dull, where secure people feel less magnetic. This is not a sign you are broken. It is a sign your system is detoxing from intensity. Detox is rarely pleasant. If you've lived in emotional highs and lows for years, calm will initially feel like emptiness. But emptiness is not absence of love. It is absence of chaos. And that difference is subtle but life-changing. The question is not whether you feel chemistry. The question is what your chemistry is rooted in. Is it rooted in shared emotional health or shared emotional wounds? Familiar pain will always try to pull you back, because it is known territory. Unknown peace requires courage. It requires tolerating discomfort long enough for your nervous system to learn a new baseline. And that is where real change begins. Not when you find someone different, but when you become comfortable with a different emotional rhythm. Because once peace stops feeling boring, you stop being magnetized to chaos. And that shifts everything. Chapter 2. Attachment wounds. Don't disappear. They repeat. You don't randomly fall for certain types of people. You're pulled toward emotional dynamics that feel familiar to your attachment system. And attachment is not about who you love. It's about how safe love feels to you. Long before you had romantic relationships, you learned something about closeness. You learned, is love consistent? Is it conditional? Is it stable? Or does it disappear? As children, we adapt to our emotional environment. If a caregiver was inconsistent, you may have learned to become hyper-attuned. If love felt distant, you may have learned to pursue harder. If closeness felt overwhelming, you may have learned to withdraw. Those adaptations don't vanish when you start dating. They follow you, and they shape who feels attractive. Someone with anxious attachment often feels intense attraction towards someone avoidant, not because they are compatible, but because they fit each other's wound. The anxious partner fears abandonment. The avoidant partner fears engulfment. One pursues, one distances, one seeks reassurance, one seeks space, and the dance begins. It feels electric. It feels consuming. It feels important. But it is often two nervous systems reacting to old pain. An anxious attachment system is hypersensitive to distance. Small changes feel threatening. Delayed replies feel personal. Silence feels like rejection. The body reacts before the mind can calm it. Heart rate increases. Thoughts spiral. Urgency rises. That urgency can feel like love, but it is often fear activated. On the other side, an avoidant attachment system experiences closeness as pressure. When intimacy deepens, discomfort rises. Not because they don't care, but because vulnerability feels unsafe. So they create space, they pull back, they detach emotionally. This triggers the anxious partner more. The more one chases, the more the other retreats. And strangely, both feel validated. The anxious partner says, "I knew I wasn't enough." The avoidant partner says, "I knew closeness would overwhelm me." Each one confirms their old belief. This is what repetition looks like. Not conscious choice. Unresolved attachment wounds seeking familiar roles. If you have anxious tendencies, you may feel bored with someone secure. Secure partners communicate clearly. They don't play games. They don't create mystery. They don't disappear to create desire. They stay consistent. And consistency can feel flat to a system used to volatility. If you have avoidant tendencies, you may feel attracted to people who chase you, not because you want them, but because distance feels safer when someone else is reaching. You feel in control. Control feels stabilizing, but underneath control is fear of vulnerability. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We are often attracted to people who activate our core wound, because activation feels alive. But being activated is not the same as being loved. When attachment wounds are unexamined, relationships become reenactments. You're not meeting someone new. You're replaying something old. You might say, "This person is different," but the emotional rhythm feels identical. The same anxiety, the same tension, the same push and pull. Attachment repetition doesn't happen because you are broken. It happens because your system is trying to complete something unresolved. There is a psychological concept called repetition compulsion. It suggests that people unconsciously recreate early emotional experiences in an attempt to master them. In other words, you may be trying to fix your childhood through your partner, trying to finally be chosen, trying to finally feel secure, trying to finally feel enough. But partners are not meant to heal the roles your nervous system created in survival mode. That work is internal. This is where many people misunderstand attraction. They assume compatibility is about shared interests. But attachment compatibility is about emotional regulation. Can you both handle closeness without panic? Can you both handle distance without fear? Can you communicate needs without shame? Secure attachment does not mean perfection. It means emotional safety. It means disagreements don't threaten the bond. It means space doesn't signal abandonment. It means closeness doesn't feel suffocating. If your attachment wounds are active, secure dynamics may feel unfamiliar. And unfamiliar often feels wrong at first, but what feels intense is not always what is healthy. And what feels calm is not always boring, it may simply be new. Healing attachment is not about becoming emotionless. It is about increasing tolerance for stability. It is about calming your nervous system enough to choose differently. The goal is not to blame your past. The goal is to understand how it shaped your attraction template. When you understand your attachment style, you stop personalizing every reaction. You recognize patterns sooner. You notice when anxiety is speaking instead of intuition. You notice when withdrawal is protection instead of preference. And awareness gives you space. Space between trigger and reaction. Space between attraction and action. Space to ask, am I drawn to this person, or am I drawn to the emotional script I already know? Because until you interrupt attachment repetition, you will continue to meet the same dynamic wearing different faces, and you will call it coincidence. But it is conditioning, and conditioning can be rewritten. Not by finding someone secure, but by becoming more secure within yourself. When your nervous system learns that closeness can be safe and space can be stable, your attraction begins to shift. Not dramatically, gradually, but profoundly. Because when you stop seeking someone to complete your wound, you start choosing someone who complements your growth. And that changes everything. Chapter 3. Intensity is not intimacy. There is a feeling many people confuse with love. It's electric, it's consuming. It makes your stomach tighten and your thoughts race. You think about them constantly. You feel high when they're close. You feel crushed when they pull away. And because it feels powerful, you call it connection. But intensity is not intimacy. Intensity activates you. Intimacy regulates you. That distinction changes everything. Intensity often begins fast. The chemistry is immediate. The conversations are deep on day 2. Vulnerability feels accelerated. You feel seen, chosen, special. But what's actually happening inside your body? Your nervous system is activated, not soothed. When attraction is rooted in unresolved wounds, your system doesn't relax. It goes into alert mode. You feel excitement, but your body is on edge. Your heart rate increases. Your thoughts speed up. You check your phone repeatedly. You're not calm, you are stimulated, and stimulation can feel like passion, but it's often anxiety mixed with desire. There is a biological reason for this. In unpredictable relationships, your brain releases dopamine inconsistently. When affection is uncertain, your brain anticipates reward more intensely. This is called intermittent reinforcement. It is one of the strongest conditioning mechanisms known in psychology. It is the same pattern that keeps people gambling. You don't know when you'll win, so you keep playing. In toxic dynamics, love becomes the jackpot. Silence becomes the uncertainty. When they text after withdrawing, your brain floods with relief. Relief feels euphoric, but relief is not love. It is the release of anxiety. The high you feel is not connection. It is the drop from stress to temporary safety, and your body becomes addicted to that cycle. Withdrawal, anxiety, reconnection, relief, over and over. You begin to equate emotional turbulence with depth. But depth does not destabilize you. Real intimacy builds slowly. It doesn't spike your cortisol levels. It doesn't leave you guessing. It doesn't make you question your worth daily. But here is why intensity feels convincing. If you grew up in environments where love was inconsistent, your body learned that closeness requires vigilance. So when someone makes you feel uncertain, your system activates. Activation feels familiar. Familiar feels meaningful. And meaningful feels important. You mistake activation for destiny. You say things like, "I've never felt this way before." And you're right. You haven't felt this exact combination of anxiety and hope before. But what you're feeling may not be intimacy. It may be trauma bonding. Trauma bonding happens when emotional pain and emotional reward become intertwined. The same person who hurts you becomes the one who comforts you. The same person who withdraws becomes the one who reassures you. Your nervous system attaches to the relief, not the person. And because the relief feels powerful, you interpret it as connection. But healthy intimacy does not require pain to feel strong. It does not depend on unpredictability to feel alive. It does not demand emotional survival skills. Intimacy feels steady, and steady can feel unfamiliar if you are used to chaos. That's why many people leave secure partners saying there just wasn't enough passion. What they mean is there wasn't enough activation. When you meet someone emotionally available, the pace is slower. Conversations unfold naturally. There is no dramatic push and pull, no emotional cliff. And if your baseline has been high-intensity dynamics, calm will feel underwhelming. But underwhelming is not the same as unhealthy. Your nervous system may initially interpret calm as lack, but calm is actually safety. And safety does not produce adrenaline. It produces regulation. There is a difference between feeling butterflies and feeling grounded. Butterflies often come from uncertainty. Groundedness comes from trust. Butterflies are not wrong. But if your entire attraction is built on nervous excitement, you may be bonding to instability. When someone triggers your fear of abandonment, your system becomes alert. You analyze their tone, you monitor their behavior, you replay conversations. You call this being invested, but it may be hypervigilance. Hypervigilance feels intense. It feels like caring deeply, but it is actually your body trying to prevent loss. Love does not require constant monitoring. It does not require decoding mixed signals. It does not require emotional guessing games. True intimacy allows you to exhale. Intensity keeps you bracing. And many people have spent so long bracing that they mistake tension for connection. Here is a difficult question. If the relationship suddenly became stable, predictable, and emotionally safe, would you still feel the same attraction? If the highs and lows disappeared, would the connection remain? If not, then the intensity may have been the glue. And glue built on instability cannot hold long-term peace. This doesn't mean you should fear strong chemistry. It means you should examine its source. Is it built on shared values and emotional maturity? Or on mutual wounds and activation patterns? When two regulated people connect, there can still be passion. But it is not chaotic. It is not threatening. It does not make you question your self-worth. It feels warm, not volatile. The work is not to eliminate chemistry. The work is to retrain your nervous system to associate calm with connection. That takes time, because your body may initially crave what spikes it. But spikes are not sustainability. If you want relationships that last, you must learn to distinguish between emotional fireworks and emotional safety. One burns bright and fast. The other builds slowly and deeply. And here is the truth. Intensity makes you feel alive. Intimacy makes you feel secure. Only one of those creates long-term peace. When you stop confusing the two, your attraction begins to shift, and what once felt boring starts to feel safe. Chapter 4. You fall in love with potential. There is a version of them that exists only in your mind, and sometimes that is the version you love. Not who they are, not how they show up consistently, not how they treat you when things are inconvenient, but who they could become. Potential is seductive. It whispers possibility. It promises transformation. It makes you believe that if you just love them enough, support them enough, understand them deeply enough, something will shift. And that belief feels hopeful. But hope can become denial when it ignores reality. Falling in love with potential is not irrational. It often comes from empathy. You see their wounds, you see their pain, you see their history. And you imagine the healed version of them. You connect not to who they are today, but to who you believe they will be tomorrow. This is called fantasy attachment. Fantasy attachment happens when you bond to your projection rather than the person in front of you. You fill in gaps with optimism. You minimize red flags. You interpret inconsistency as growth in progress. You tell yourself they just need time. They've never had someone like me before. I can help them become who they're meant to be. But relationships are not rehabilitation centers, and love is not a renovation project. There is a subtle psychological mechanism at work here. Projection. When you project, you attribute your own desires, values, or hopes onto someone else. If you value growth, you assume they do too. If you are loyal, you assume they will become loyal. If you are self-aware, you assume they will eventually reflect. But assumption is not evidence, and desire is not proof. The danger of projection is that it allows you to ignore patterns. You see glimpses of kindness and treat them as consistency. You hear promises and treat them as progress. You mistake intention for transformation, but potential is not behavior, and behavior is what builds safety. Here is the deeper layer. Many people who fall in love with potential carry a subtle savior complex. Not in an arrogant way, in a compensatory way. If you grew up needing to fix emotional tension in your environment, you may have learned that love means repair. If you were the peacemaker, the caretaker, the emotionally mature one, that role may feel natural. So when you meet someone wounded, you feel purpose. You feel needed. And being needed can feel like being loved, but being needed is not the same as being valued. When your identity is tied to helping, you may unconsciously seek partners who require help. Not because you want dysfunction, but because helping feels familiar. It gives you control. It gives you direction. It gives you significance. You become emotionally invested in their growth. But their growth may not match your timeline or your expectations. And slowly, what began as empathy turns into exhaustion. You are carrying both sides of the relationship. You are managing emotional labor. You are excusing behavior in the name of potential. And over time, resentment builds because potential never materializes into consistency. There is another psychological dynamic here. When you fall in love with potential, you are often trying to rewrite an old story. Perhaps there was someone in your past who never changed, a parent, a caregiver, an early attachment figure, and now, unconsciously, you are trying again. This time, maybe they will choose you fully. This time, maybe your love will be enough. This time, maybe you will finally succeed in being worth it. But the partner in front of you is not your past, and they are not a test you need to pass. Yet repetition compulsion pulls you towards similar emotional terrain. Because if they change, it validates you. If they grow, it proves your love was powerful. If they transform, it heals something old inside you. But another person's growth cannot be your emotional closure. Closure comes from acceptance, not from renovation. When you remove the fantasy and look only at behavior, the picture becomes clearer. Do they communicate consistently? Do they take responsibility without defensiveness? Do they follow through? Do they regulate their emotions without making you responsible for them? If the answer is not yet, and it has been not yet for a long time, you are not loving potential. You are postponing reality, and reality is uncomfortable because it forces you to confront loss, loss of the imagined future, loss of who you hoped they would become, loss of the story you created. Grieving potential is painful, but clinging to it is more damaging because the longer you invest in who someone might be, the longer you disconnect from who they are. And who they are today is the only version you are actually in a relationship with. There is maturity in loving someone as they are. There is wisdom in leaving when who they are does not align with what you need. You cannot build stability on promises. You cannot build safety on intention. You cannot build intimacy on someday. Healthy relationships are built on present behavior, not projected futures. This does not mean people cannot grow. They can. But growth must be self-driven, not partner-driven. When you stop trying to develop someone into your vision, something shifts. You start observing instead of imagining. You start assessing instead of hoping. You start choosing based on consistency, not chemistry. And here's the turning point. When you no longer need someone to change in order to feel secure, you become less attracted to those who need changing, because you are no longer seeking purpose through fixing. You are seeking partnership, and partnership requires two regulated adults, not one rescuer and one project. The more secure you become internally, the less appealing potential becomes. Because secure attachment values predictability over promise. It values stability over story. It values present reality over imagined transformation. Falling in love with potential feels romantic, but choosing someone based on who they consistently are is powerful. And power in relationships is not about control. It is about clarity. When clarity replaces fantasy, your attraction recalibrates, and the people you once tried to save no longer feel like destiny. Chapter 5. Low self-worth quietly lowers your standards. No one consciously says, "I deserve to be disrespected." No one enters a relationship hoping to feel small, and yet many people tolerate dynamics that slowly erode their dignity, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. Low self-worth does not always look like insecurity. Sometimes it looks like over-understanding, over-forgiving, over-giving. It looks like explaining away behavior that hurt you. It looks like minimizing your needs so you don't feel too much. It looks like convincing yourself that you are asking for too much when you are simply asking for basic consistency. Low self-worth does not announce itself. It negotiates. It whispers, "Maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe they're just stressed. Maybe I should be more patient." And patience becomes self-abandonment. Here is the psychological layer. Your standards are not set by what you say you want. They are set by what you believe you deserve. If deep down you believe love must be earned, you will tolerate emotional labor. If you believe you are hard to love, you will overcompensate. If you believe people eventually leave, you will accept breadcrumbs to avoid being alone. These beliefs often form early. If praise was conditional, you learned performance equals love. If affection was inconsistent, you learned effort equals safety. If criticism was frequent, you internalized inadequacy. These early experiences shape your self-concept, and your self-concept shapes your relationship tolerance. When someone treats you poorly, your reaction is filtered through identity. A secure person sees disrespect and thinks, "That's not aligned with me." A person with low self-worth sees disrespect and thinks, "What did I do wrong?" The event is the same. The interpretation is different, and interpretation determines behavior. When your internal identity is fragile, you seek validation externally. Approval becomes currency. Attention becomes reassurance. Being chosen becomes proof of worth. And if someone withdraws, it doesn't just feel like rejection. It feels like confirmation. Confirmation of the belief, "I am not enough." That belief is powerful. Because once it exists, you subconsciously choose situations that reinforce it, not intentionally. Conditioned. If you feel unworthy, you may unconsciously feel more comfortable with partners who are emotionally unavailable. Because deep down, their inconsistency matches your internal narrative. You may feel anxious when someone treats you well, suspicious when someone respects you, uncomfortable when someone values you consistently, because it contradicts your identity, and contradiction feels unsafe. Low self-worth lowers standards in subtle ways. You tell yourself, "At least they're trying. At least they didn't cheat. At least they texted back eventually." You compare downward to feel grateful, but gratitude should not require deprivation. When your standards are low, you focus on what is not happening instead of what is. They didn't yell. They didn't lie this time. They didn't disappear for days. You start measuring progress by reduced damage instead of increased safety. And that is not growth. It is survival. Survival mode in relationships keeps you vigilant. It keeps you negotiating. It keeps you accepting partial effort because full effort feels unrealistic. But here is the truth. When you believe deep down that you are replaceable, you will compete for stability instead of require it. You will work harder instead of step back. You will prove instead of observe. And proving love is exhausting. Healthy love does not require proof. It requires reciprocity. Low self-worth also distorts boundaries. You say yes when you mean no. You tolerate behavior you once promised yourself you wouldn't. You avoid confrontation because conflict feels threatening. You fear that setting a boundary will lead to abandonment. So you shrink. You soften your needs. You convince yourself it's compromise. But compromise requires two secure people. Self-silencing is not compromise, it is fear. At the core of low self-worth is often shame, not guilt. Shame. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. And when shame drives your self-image, relationships become arenas for validation. You look for someone to disprove your fear, to prove you are lovable, to prove you are enough. But external proof never fixes internal belief. Because if you don't believe you are worthy, any love you receive will feel temporary. You will constantly scan for signs that it's about to disappear. And that scanning creates tension. Tension leads to insecurity. Insecurity leads to overcompensation. Overcompensation attracts imbalance, and imbalance breeds resentment. It becomes a loop. Here is the shift. Raising your standards is not arrogance, it is alignment. It is deciding that respect, consistency, and emotional safety are non-negotiable. But you cannot maintain high standards if your self-image contradicts them. If you believe you are lucky just to be chosen, you will accept almost anything to stay chosen. But when you understand your inherent worth, not performative worth, something changes. You stop chasing, you start evaluating, you stop proving, you start observing, you stop asking, how can I keep them? And start asking, is this aligned with who I am becoming? Low self-worth narrows your choices. Self-respect expands them. When you truly believe you are worthy of stable love, you are willing to walk away from unstable dynamics. Not angrily, not dramatically, calmly, because you understand that being alone is not evidence of inadequacy. It is space for alignment, and that is powerful. Your standards are not about demanding perfection. They are about refusing emotional chaos. They are about honoring your nervous system. They are about protecting your long-term peace. The moment your self-worth increases, certain people become less attractive, not because they changed, but because you did. And when you no longer believe you must earn love, you stop tolerating love that makes you shrink. Chapter 6. You ignore red flags to avoid. Being alone. Red flags are rarely invisible. Most of the time, you see them early. You feel the inconsistency. You notice the defensiveness. You sense the emotional unavailability. But instead of walking away, you negotiate. You tell yourself, it's still early. No one is perfect. Maybe I'm overthinking. And slowly, your intuition becomes quieter. Not because it disappeared, but because you chose connection over clarity. Ignoring red flags is rarely about ignorance. It is about fear. Specifically, the fear of being alone. Loneliness is uncomfortable. It exposes silence. It removes distraction. It forces you to sit with yourself without the dopamine spikes of emotional drama. For many people, that silence feels heavier than instability, because instability still feels like something, and something feels better than nothing. But here is the psychological truth. When you ignore red flags, you are not protecting the relationship. You are protecting yourself from temporary emptiness. The problem is that temporary emptiness grows into long-term pain. Fear of abandonment is one of the most powerful drivers in relationships. If you experienced early emotional loss through inconsistency, neglect, or unpredictability, your nervous system may equate separation with danger. Even if you are an adult, even if you are logically safe. When someone pulls away, your body may respond as if survival is threatened. Your heart races. Your thoughts spiral. Your stomach tightens. You don't just fear losing them, you fear losing stability. You fear being unwanted. You fear confirming the old belief, I will always end up alone. That belief makes red flags negotiable. You see controlling behavior and call it insecurity. You see inconsistency and call it stress. You see disrespect and call it miscommunication. This is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance happens when your reality conflicts with your desire. You want the relationship to work. but the evidence suggests instability. So your mind reduces discomfort by reinterpreting reality. You shrink the problem to protect the attachment. And each time you do that, you weaken trust in yourself. Self-betrayal rarely feels dramatic. It feels like compromise. You say, "I'll just give it more time." But time does not change patterns without awareness. Another layer here is attachment anxiety. When you are afraid of abandonment, you become hypersensitive to loss. Ending a relationship feels catastrophic, even if the relationship is unhealthy, even if you are exhausted, even if you know it is misaligned. The pain of leaving feels worse than the pain of staying, because staying still gives you access to hope. Leaving forces you into grief, and grief is quiet. It does not give adrenaline, it gives stillness. Many people stay, not because they are happy, but because hope feels safer than grief. Hope says, maybe they'll change. Grief says, it's over. Hope keeps the door open. Grief closes it, but healing requires closure. There's also a deeper reason red flags are ignored. Loneliness often triggers shame. Society romanticizes relationships. Being single is sometimes interpreted as failure. So staying in something dysfunctional feels less embarrassing than being alone. You would rather say, "We're working through things," than say, "I walked away." But strength is rarely visible at first. Walking away from instability is not failure, it is regulation. Another subtle factor is intermittent reinforcement. When someone alternates between warmth and distance, your brain clings to the warm moments. The brain remembers the reward, not the pain. You focus on the apology, not the pattern. You focus on the good weekend, not the repeated inconsistency. And your attachment deepens, because unpredictability strengthens bonding. Ignoring red flags is not stupidity, it is attachment protecting itself. But protection can become self-sabotage. Every time you override your intuition to avoid being alone, you send your nervous system a message. My needs are secondary to connection, and over time, that message reshapes your self-trust. You begin doubting your instincts. You begin normalizing discomfort. You begin adapting to dysfunction until dysfunction feels ordinary. Loneliness detox is part of healing, and detox feels uncomfortable. When you leave an unstable dynamic, your nervous system initially panics. Not because you made the wrong choice, but because the stimulation is gone. The checking, the waiting, the emotional swings. Silence replaces chaos, and silence feels foreign. You may mistake that silence for loss of purpose. But what you're experiencing is nervous system recalibration. Your body is learning that calm does not equal danger, that being alone does not equal rejection, that emptiness is not permanent. When you tolerate loneliness long enough, something shifts. You start feeling relief instead of panic. You start noticing peace instead of absence. You start realizing that many of your fears were amplified by activation, not reality. Ignoring red flags keeps you in cycles. Honoring red flags builds self-trust, and self-trust is foundational for secure attachment. When you trust yourself, you don't need perfect certainty to leave. You only need alignment. You stop asking, "What if I'm wrong?" and start asking, "Why am I tolerating what feels wrong?" That shift is powerful. Because the moment you choose solitude over self-betrayal, you teach your nervous system that you are safe with yourself. And when you are safe with yourself, you stop clinging to people who make you feel unsafe. Red flags are not punishments. They are information. And information is only useful if you act on it. The fear of being alone may feel overwhelming at first, but the fear of staying misaligned costs more over time. You're not meant to sacrifice your intuition for companionship. You are meant to strengthen your intuition through discernment. And when discernment replaces desperation, your attraction shifts again. Because you are no longer looking for someone to prevent loneliness. You are looking for someone who aligns with peace. Chapter 7. Leaving feels like withdrawal. One of the most confusing parts of toxic relationships is this: you finally leave. You know it was unhealthy, you know it was unstable, you know it was draining, and yet you miss them, not logically, biologically. Your body craves the very thing that hurt you. This is where many people go back, not because they forgot the pain, but because withdrawal feels unbearable. When a relationship is built on intermittent reinforcement, unpredictable affection, emotional highs and lows, your nervous system adapts to stimulation. Your brain becomes accustomed to dopamine spikes. Anticipation, relief, reconnection. Each cycle strengthens attachment, even when the attachment is harmful. So when you leave, your system doesn't celebrate. It panics. The stimulation disappears. The uncertainty disappears. The emotional roller coaster disappears. And what replaces it is silence. Silence can feel like loss of identity, because in unstable dynamics, you are constantly engaged, checking your phone, replaying conversations, analyzing tone, planning what to say next. Your mind was occupied, your nervous system was activated, and activation feels alive. When you leave, that activation drops, and your body experiences it as emptiness. But emptiness is not always sadness. It is often detox. Think of it this way. If someone consumes sugar daily for years, their body adjusts to constant spikes. When they stop, the absence feels uncomfortable, not because sugar was nourishing, but because the body adapted to it. Trauma bonds work similarly. The cycle of hurt and relief creates biochemical dependency. When the hurt stops, so does the relief. And without relief, the brain feels deprived. You may suddenly remember only the good moments. You may romanticize the connection. You may think, maybe it wasn't that bad. This is not clarity, it is craving. Your nervous system is searching for familiar stimulation, and the fastest way to relieve withdrawal is to re-engage. Send the message, check their social media, reopen the conversation. And temporarily, the craving eases, but the cycle restarts. Leaving toxic dynamics requires more than logic. It requires tolerance. Tolerance for discomfort. Tolerance for silence. Tolerance for grief. Grief is another layer people misunderstand. When you leave, you are not only grieving the person, you are grieving the fantasy, the potential, the imagined future, the version of them you hoped would exist. That grief can blur memory. It can make the relationship appear more beautiful than it was, but grieving potential is part of healing. There is also identity disruption. In unstable relationships, especially anxious avoidant ones, your identity can revolve around the connection. You were the fixer, the pursuer, the patient one, the strong one. When the relationship ends, those roles disappear. And without them, you may feel disoriented. Who are you when you are not trying to keep someone? Who are you when you are not emotionally managing someone else? That emptiness is not weakness. It is space. Space where your identity begins to separate from survival patterns. Withdrawal symptoms can look like restlessness, obsessional thinking, emotional waves, strong urges to reconnect, sudden nostalgia. These are not signs you made the wrong decision. They are signs your nervous system is recalibrating. Recalibration feels unstable at first. Your baseline was chaos. Now, your baseline is quiet. Quiet feels foreign, and foreign can feel threatening. Many people interpret this discomfort as loneliness. But loneliness is not the same as withdrawal. Withdrawal is craving stimulation. Loneliness is longing for connection. If what you feel is intense urgency tied to one specific person, that is often attachment activation, not love. Love does not create panic when it ends. Attachment dysregulation does. This does not mean the relationship meant nothing. It means your system bonded through intensity. and intensity leaves residue. Healing requires staying with the discomfort long enough for your body to learn a new rhythm. Instead of reacting to urges, you observe them. Instead of contacting them, you sit with the craving. Instead of romanticizing the highs, you remember the full picture. The nervous system learns through repetition. Each time you resist re-engaging, you strengthen self-trust. Each time you choose silence over chaos, you build regulation. Gradually, the waves become smaller. The cravings become less urgent. The silence becomes neutral. And eventually, the silence becomes peaceful. This is the stage many people never reach. Because they go back too soon, not because they are weak, because detox feels uncomfortable. But discomfort is not danger, it is transformation. Leaving a toxic relationship is not just leaving a person, it is leaving a pattern. And patterns resist change. Your body will try to return to what it knows. But if you stay steady, if you allow the withdrawal to pass without reacting, something powerful happens. Your nervous system begins to trust stability. You begin to associate calm with safety. You begin to experience connection without anxiety. And when that shift happens, something else changes too. The people who once felt magnetic begin to feel overwhelming. The drama that once felt romantic begins to feel exhausting. The inconsistency that once felt exciting begins to feel immature. Your attraction evolves, not because you forced it, but because your baseline changed. Leaving feels like withdrawal at first, but staying would have been long-term erosion. Short-term discomfort leads to long-term peace, and peace does not spike. It settles. When you can tolerate the withdrawal without returning to chaos, you prove to yourself that you are stronger than the pattern. And that is the moment you stop being addicted to intensity. Chapter 8. You don't attract better. You become different. There is a belief many people carry after toxic relationships. Next time, I just need to choose better. It sounds logical, but it misses something deeper. Because attraction is not a random event. It is a reflection of your internal baseline. You do not attract better by trying harder. You attract differently when you become different. Different in regulation, different in self-worth, different in boundaries, different in tolerance. When your nervous system shifts, your attraction shifts. That is not motivational language. It is psychological reality. Earlier, we explored familiarity, attachment wounds, trauma bonding, projection, self-worth, fear of abandonment, withdrawal. All of those patterns have one root: internal conditioning. And conditioning shapes what feels magnetic. If chaos feels familiar, you are magnetized to chaos. If unpredictability feels alive, you are drawn to unpredictability. If earning love feels normal, you will pursue partners who require effort. But when your internal state stabilizes, something subtle begins to happen. The same behaviors that once felt attractive begin to feel exhausting. The same mystery that once felt intriguing begins to feel immature. The same emotional distance that once felt challenging begins to feel misaligned. You don't force this shift. It happens naturally when your identity changes. Identity is not what you say you want. It is what you tolerate. It is what feels acceptable. It is what feels normal. When you deeply internalize that you deserve emotional safety, your body stops responding to inconsistency as chemistry. It responds as caution. When you no longer fear being alone, emotional unavailability loses its power. When you regulate your own nervous system, you no longer need someone else's intensity to feel alive. And that is where attraction recalibrates. Becoming different is not about becoming colder. It is about becoming clearer. Clear about what aligns. Clear about what destabilizes you. Clear about what you no longer participate in. This clarity shows up in small moments. You don't chase delayed replies. You don't excuse repeated patterns. You don't argue with reality. You observe, you assess, you choose. And choice feels different from compulsion. In earlier stages of healing, attraction feels compulsive. You feel pulled, drawn, overtaken. But when you become internally secure, attraction feels calm. You feel interested, curious, grounded. There is no urgency. There is no panic. There is no need to secure someone quickly. Because you are already secure within yourself. Secure attachment is not dramatic. It does not spike adrenaline. It does not create emotional roller coasters. It feels steady. And steady used to feel boring. But now it feels safe. When you become different, you start valuing consistency over intensity, accountability over apology, presence over promise, reality over fantasy. You stop dating potential, you start dating patterns. You look at how someone handles stress, how they communicate discomfort, how they respond to boundaries. You don't focus on how strongly you feel. You focus on how safe you feel. That shift is powerful because safety builds intimacy, and intimacy sustains connection. Another important transformation happens internally. You stop outsourcing validation. You stop needing someone else to prove your worth. You no longer see relationships as a measure of your value. They become a complement to your life, not the center of your identity. This reduces desperation, and desperation is often what keeps people attached to misalignment. When you are not desperate for connection, you can walk away without drama, not because you don't care, but because you care about yourself. Self-respect becomes louder than fear. And when self-respect is loud, toxic dynamics become unattractive. It is important to understand something here. You cannot become different by pretending. You cannot fake regulation. You cannot intellectually convince yourself you deserve better while emotionally tolerating less. Change happens through repetition, through honoring boundaries consistently, through staying in solitude long enough to stabilize, through choosing discomfort over chaos repeatedly, through therapy, reflection, accountability, through facing your attachment patterns without shame. Gradually, your internal identity shifts. You no longer see yourself as someone who is always unlucky in love. You see yourself as someone who once repeated patterns and now chooses differently. And when identity shifts, attraction follows. You begin noticing different qualities in people. Calmness becomes appealing. Emotional intelligence becomes attractive. Responsibility becomes magnetic. The people who once captivated you may now feel draining, not because they changed, but because you did. There is a quiet confidence that emerges from this transformation. It is not loud, it is not defensive, it is not performative, it is stable. You no longer need to convince anyone of your worth. You demonstrate it by what you refuse. And what you refuse determines what remains. This is the final truth. You don't break toxic cycles by finding someone secure. You break them by becoming secure. You don't attract healthy love by wishing for it. You attract it by embodying it. And when your nervous system no longer confuses chaos with connection, when your self-worth no longer negotiates for breadcrumbs, when your fear of abandonment no longer overrides your intuition, your pattern changes. And when the pattern changes, your relationships change. Not because luck improved, but because you did. And that is power. If you've made it this far, I want to speak to you directly. Not as a teacher, not as an expert, but as someone who has had to face these patterns personally. It is easier to say they were toxic. It is harder to say, I participated in something I didn't fully understand. That shift is uncomfortable, but it is powerful, because the moment you move from blaming to understanding, you reclaim control. There was a time when I believed attraction was destiny. If it felt intense, it must be real. If it hurt deeply, it must mean I cared deeply. If it was hard to let go, it must have been special. But intensity is not proof of compatibility. Pain is not proof of love. Difficulty is not proof of depth. Sometimes it is proof of repetition, and repetition is not fate. It is conditioning. The most liberating realization in this journey is this: you are not broken, you are patterned, and patterns can be changed, not overnight, not through willpower alone, but through awareness, repetition, and courage. If I could offer you a few grounded pieces of advice moving forward, they would be these. First, slow down your attraction. Chemistry that feels explosive at the beginning often masks activation. Give yourself time to observe behavior without projecting potential. If someone is consistent over months, not days, that tells you more than any intense weekend ever could. Second, listen to your body when it is calm, not when it is triggered. Triggered states distort perception. Calm states clarify it. If you constantly feel anxious, confused, or destabilized around someone, that is information, not something to override. Third, practice tolerating solitude. Loneliness detox is real. There will be moments when being alone feels louder than being in chaos. Stay through that phase. It is not emptiness, it is recalibration. Fourth, build your self-worth outside of romantic validation. Friendships, purpose, health, growth. The stronger your internal foundation, the less you will cling to unstable connections. Fifth, set small boundaries early, not dramatic ultimatums. Simple clarity. Observe how people respond to your boundaries. Secure individuals respect them. Insecure individuals resist them. That response tells you everything. And finally, be patient with yourself. You are unlearning emotional habits that may have been wired for decades. There will be moments when you miss what hurt you. There will be moments when chaos feels tempting. That does not mean you failed. It means your nervous system is adjusting. Growth is not linear, but it is cumulative. Every time you choose self-respect over urgency, every time you walk away from misalignment, every time you honor a red flag instead of negotiating it, you are becoming different. And when you become different, your relationships cannot stay the same. The goal was never to find perfect love. It was to stop participating in patterns that hurt you. It was to raise your internal baseline so that peace feels familiar. Because once peace feels familiar, chaos no longer feels magnetic. And that is the quiet transformation most people never see coming. You don't break toxic cycles by finding better people. You break them by becoming someone who no longer finds instability attractive. That is maturity, that is power, and that is something no one can take from you.